Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Also on Tuesday, prosecutors in the United States charged Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of the former cryptocurrency exchange FTX, with 8 counts of fraud and conspiracy. These claims include that he misappropriated customer deposits to FTX, and Sam Bankman-Fried has now been arrested in the Bahamas. Let's start with a clip of the FTX new CEO, John Ray. He's a lawyer who specializes in restructuring. He helped Enron. He's up on Capitol Hill today, and he's explaining in a hearing what FTX did and what it did wrong.
The FTX group's collapse appears to stem from absolute concentration of control in the hands of a small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals who failed to implement virtually any of the systems or controls that are necessary for a company entrusted with other people's money or assets. Some of the unacceptable management practices identified so far include the use of computer infrastructure that gave individuals in senior management access to systems that stored customer assets without security controls to prevent them from redirecting those assets. The storing of certain private keys to access hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto assets without effective security controls or encryption. The ability of Alameda to borrow funds held at FTX.com to be utilized for its own trading or investments without any effective limits whatsoever.
We also have a clip here of Sam Bankman-Fried trying to explain himself a few weeks ago to George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America.
Alameda is borrowing the money that belongs to FTX depositors. That's a bright red line, isn't it?
There are a lot of cases where that's actually explicitly part of the programs and that are happening.
But not here. Here it says that the digital assets may not be loaned to FTX trading. They can't be loaned out.
There existed a borrow lending facility on FTX. And I think that's probably covered, I don't remember exactly where, but somewhere else in the terms of service.
But they'd have to approve of that. They're saying they didn't approve of it here.
Kim, what do you make of this? It seems to me that Sam Bankman-Fried has been making the argument in many public interviews that essentially boils down to, whoops, we lost billions of dollars. We're not entirely sure where it went. Obviously, prosecutors are disagreeing with that counting of events.
Yeah, that has been his somewhat muddled defense since the beginning. And now we have both this prosecution from the Department of Justice, 8 counts of fraud and conspiracy, but also civil suits from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Future Trading Commission, all of which allege that this was deliberate and that it was fraud executed on customers and lenders, basically making the argument that what Sam Bankman-Fried was doing here was taking the deposits and loans from lenders and customers and using them to pay the expenses and the debts of this other side business he had, a crypto hedge fund, also to buy real estate and to make political donations. By the way, one of the allegations in here is that he broke campaign finance rules. He was conspiring to make illegal contributions. The notion that FTX was loaning money to executives for political donation. And you heard John Ray there describing the lack of internal controls, but I think that he was being a bit generous, at least in that part of his testimony. That lack of controls explains how this was able to happen. I mean, there's one little detail in this prosecution noting that there are examples of Sam Bankman-Fried both signing as an issuer and a recipient of loans, which is remarkable that you could have that much ability to kind of just handle money on your own. So the controls explain how it happened, but it doesn't get to motive. And there is a lot of claim in this DOJ prosecution and also the civil suits that this was deliberate and from the beginning, that he was essentially using this exchange as a piggy bank for other ventures of his and for his personal benefit, which is crypto can be hard for people to understand, but this is like straightforward. If it's true, this is just straightforward kind of bad management and potentially fraud.
Notable, though, that there are retail investors who have money locked up in FTX they can't get out. There are also very sophisticated investors who had money in FTX. And Joe, I wonder how much this, if you want to call it a crypto bubble, if you want to call it a mania, I wonder how much blame you put on the Fed for too much money sloshing around the economy. I mean, we can connect the second part of this podcast today with the first part. We had rates that were very low for a very long time. I mean, is that part of what's going on here?
Absolutely. That's a big part of what happened here, because that's a big part of what has happened in any mania or speculative frenzy in economic history. You can go back thousands of years and encounter this kind of phenomenon. And I think that specifically what happened here is, as you point out, Kyle, there were two kinds of investors that we're talking about here. There are retail investors who were investing in crypto and were making deposits with FTX sort of as a form of brokerage or exchange that they would use to mediate their investments in crypto assets that now turn out to be worth a lot less than they thought that they would. And some of that money may have been filtered out of their accounts to other purposes. And then the other class of investors that we're talking about here are large hedge funds, venture capital funds that invested in FTX as the business. They were investing in the business entity that would serve as the brokerage or the exchange that would offer services to those retail investors. I think that what fueled both of those kinds of investment was on the part of the institutions that were taking a flyer on this 20-something kid with a weird haircut who never put on a suit. They were willing to take that kind of flyer because they were under so much pressure from their own investors to generate higher returns in an era where interest rates were unnaturally low and there was a lot of capital chasing yield everywhere around the world. So that will tend to make this kind of very risky entrepreneur and Sam Bankman-Fried and very risky enterprise FTX seem more appealing to that kind of institution, whereas these poor retail investors were just desperate for any kind of return on their savings when the bank account, if you're lucky, was paying you 0.2% a year. And the stock markets increasingly felt like an overpriced casino. And so I think that a lot of what has fueled enthusiasm for crypto among retail investors has been the sense that they didn't really have very many other places that they could turn to get the kind of return that you used to be able to get from a combination of putting some of your cash in a basic savings account at the bank and then more of it in more secure corporate or government bonds and the rest of it into the stock market.
Kim, that raises the question, though, of whether there is some sort of a systemic crypto problem here. I mean, no doubt the people in Congress that after this hearing, during this hearing, are going to say there ought to be a law. And I mean, I'm not close enough to this to know maybe there ought to be a law. On the other hand, it is impossible to defend, I think, fully against people who are willing to lie to investors and lie to customers if that's in fact what happened here. And so do you view this as something that suggests that there's something wrong in the crypto financial system writ broadly, or is this another example of a P.T. Barnum or a Theranos? And what we really need here is enforcement of the laws we have already on the books. Or, Kim, maybe we have to see how the trial turns out and get more information.
Well, I think it's possible to believe in both. I think it's both possible to look at this specific case of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried and say that this is kind of the oldest, if it's true, again, these are allegations, but if it is proved in court, one of the oldest swindles on the books, not being forthright with your investors and your customers, sucking money out of an enterprise and using it for things that you didn't tell those investors or lenders or investors that you were using, or using it for personal profit. Okay, we've had many, many examples of this over the years, and there are many, many laws, as the Department of Justice just proved, that you can use to go after those people. That is a separate question of whether or not crypto might not need some form of regulation. Okay, and I think the real importance of what's happened here is it's simply shining a new light on that. Interestingly, in the hearing today, and poor Maxine Waters, the Democrat was holding it, was salivating to bring SBF in and grill him, only to see him arrested beforehand. So she was robbed of her star witness. But there was still a lot of talk going on in that hearing. I caught a little bit of it. And interestingly, one of the big complaints from Patrick McHenry, who is the Republican who is in line to take over this financial committee in the new Congress as the top Republican, really went after SEC Chief Gary Gensler, because Gensler, in his drive to want to be able to set the rules without actually going through the process of setting the rules, has been doing a lot of what we call regulation by enforcement, going after individual companies, bringing suits, and then by virtue of getting them to admit to something or agree to an enforcement action, sending a warning to the rest of the community that this is how the game will be played. It isn't nearly as concrete as going through an actual rulemaking process. It's kind of a cheat. And McHenry really went after him on this, saying that this is more proof that Gensler's kind of regulation by enforcement, which he's also done in part to get his oar into the crypto industry, really is not satisfactory. And there needs to be bigger thought. And that seems to be the general mindset in Washington. There are a lot of important questions to answer about that. What agency has lead? Is there joint? There's been a little bit of a rivalry here between whether the SEC should do this or the CFTC should do this. Interestingly, a lot of the political donations that Sam Bankman-Fried was making were to Democrats, which had become one of the biggest political donors of the midterm cycle. And a lot of it was aimed at lobbying for his preferred course, which was to have the CFTC set the rules of the road for crypto, and the argument that it would not be quite as aggressive as SEC. This has now landed in Congress's lap, and I think that everyone is now going to take a closer look at it. And I would bet that we get some sort of regulation on this soon, whether or not it maybe even is warranted, just because now it's an issue that no one can ignore anymore.
I would make the closing point that the one bit of financial regulation no one ever talks about here is a positive inflation-adjusted interest rate. I know this is a very Wall Street Journal editorial page point to make, but so much of these problems, so many of these problems could be avoided if you actually had a more normal monetary environment where people could get a return the old-fashioned, responsible way, and also would have incentives to vet their own investments more carefully.
Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you all for listening. You can email your inflation expectations to Joe Sternberg at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.